And welcome back. I'm thrilled to have with us Bernadette Tosti with us. She's the Chief Product Officer of ProofPilot, and she's also an advisor to New Enterprise Ventures. And Bernadette is our second guest from NEV. We have a long-term, deep relationship with our friends at NEV, and I hope this is the second of many interviews with the advisors, because everybody I meet who comes onto the board of NEV is just top-notch and has lots of just chock full of information to share with us. Bernadette is everything about patient journey, about clinical trials and recruiting, and she's a wealth of knowledge. And we're going to take some time to talk today with her about clinical trial recruiting, how it's changed and how it's morphing, and kind of the views of the marketplace and what we can expect over the next few years in this particular space. Because from my perspective, Bernadette, it seems like old world practices seem to rule in this space, and it seems so hard to get rid of some of these old world practices that we shouldn't be doing and embracing some of the new world practices that we should be doing. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that, we've done for many, many years. I got involved in clinical trial recruitment technology back in 2006. And I will say, there's probably a lot less that has changed than you would expect. So we do a lot of the same things. There's a lot of the same inefficiencies, a lot of different gates you have to go through. So I do think there's space for things to be done a little bit more efficiently. I think it's hard to change, the way people do things in clinical trials, because it's so highly regulated and people are used to a certain mechanism. And so they feel comfortable with it. But we are making incremental progress as we go through the years.
What are some of the most exciting changes you see in this space that you think will really make a difference in, I think, everybody's goal of our last guest from NEV was spoke about diversity, equity, inclusion, how it's really mandated in clinical trials. Tell us what you see in the forefront in the next few years changing to make sure we have more diverse trials.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. Number one, from the point of view of diversity, since you brought that up specifically, I think there's a couple of things that are helping support diversity. One is the idea of decentralization in clinical trials, allowing folks to, to kind of draw from anywhere. I think we're also learning that there are implicit biases within, individuals, each of us, and then that extends to our healthcare clinics, et cetera. And oftentimes, we might be making assumptions about patients before we present a trial to them. And, we need to kind of help ourselves as individuals and collectively sites and other organizations to say, hey, let's let the individual decide. Let's not decide for them that they might not want to participate before they're even offered. I mean, I think what I've seen is that when people are given the opportunity to participate in clinical trials, and I did this, in a decentralized trial capacity, as long as someone was introduced the opportunity, it didn't seem to make much of a difference what race, what ethnicity they identified with. So I think that's kind of interesting, because that's not necessarily what we've told ourselves over the years. And then I think the other thing that can help us is just, it's hard to get people through that funnel that we talk about, because there's a lot of inefficiencies, right? We're pushing patients sometimes directly to a site. Sometimes we're pushing them to a contact center that's doing a pre-screen. But at some point, the site needs to take an action with that patient. And oftentimes they've got a lot of other things going on. That patient might get aged in that system. So really looking at ways that we can support our sites to be able to move people through the process more efficiently, maybe taking some of the burden off of the site. So, I think all of those things can help us with recruitment in general, but also, to make sure that we are getting the diverse patients that we're looking for.
In terms of the one of the things we're seeing in the marketplace is a lot of new entries into the space of recruiting. It used to be kind of a wide net was the approach. And now we're seeing CVS clinical trials in and then out. Allscripts is trying to get in, Quest Diagnostics, all these kind of specialty folks that have the data values. Do you see that getting traction in the future? Do you see that taking off?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually at Quest Diagnostics back several years ago and inaugurated their clinical trials business related to recruitment and feasibility. I think it's amazing when large healthcare organizations who already have, firstly, a brand reputation, and secondly, the penetration into both the patient and clinician spaces, want to get involved. I know the folks at CVS, they were doing tremendous work. It's unfortunate that the business at large decided to discontinue that. I'm super excited about the work Walgreens is doing, and great to hear about other entrants like Allscripts. So I think in general, it's great. And I think the reason why it's so fantastic, and the reason why when I was at Quest, I was so excited about it, was that, our problem is, I think, with clinical trial recruitment is essentially an awareness problem. And it's been an awareness problem for a long time. And when I say that, I just mean that most people will never see a clinical trial ad or respond to one. It won't be relevant to them, or they'll never be approached by their clinician for a clinical trial. And so the more people who have access to the idea of clinical trials in general, and COVID did us a nice service in making clinical trials a little bit more, like in the vernacular. But really, I think these large organizations can really help demystify clinical trials, so that the first time you hear about a clinical trial isn't when somebody is approaching you to participate. And maybe you learn about a few different ones. Maybe, you just get some general education, and then maybe you're getting introduced to a trial from a trusted, source, someone, your pharmacy, for example, or with Quest Diagnostics, obviously a laboratory. So I think it's great. And I think that hopefully these solutions will continue to gain traction. Clinical trials is a tough space to be in because it's very narrow. And I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, we were seeing really large trials that, were cardiovascular, et cetera, where a lot of people would qualify. And now we're seeing a narrowing down to trials that are much more highly specific, really looking for that needle in a haystack, even in conditions that aren't rare. And so it's harder and harder, even if you are interested, to participate. So having that broad awareness building, I think, is going to really help us both introduce trials and accelerate the enrollment.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be essential, actually. I mean, you're bringing up a point that's quite interesting, is as medical technology gets more sophisticated, the therapies that are being developed are more targeted, which means the inclusion-exclusion criteria are going to be tougher.
Yeah, and then it begets the need for like more specific screening, so that we can try to understand more about potential trial candidates before they get to the site, even. So that, we're not seeing a ton of screen fails.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make. And it's from the perspective of the clinical trial participant, I think trying to make that patient journey a good journey, I think goes a very long way toward what you're describing as just getting better PR out there for clinical trials. I think COVID, you're right. I think COVID did a great job in helping raise everybody's awareness. But I think after COVID, I think it kind of dropped back down again, because COVID was one of those very broad spectrums, but nobody realizes that, clinical trial activity is still continuing after the COVID vaccine.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that you say, about kind of keeping people involved sort of through that process, because it can be really challenging. And, you hear stories about patients who desperately want to participate in a clinical trial because, for example, they have cancer or something, and they simply cannot get the paperwork moved across the desks of whomever. The site isn't activated yet, or whatever it is. And for those people, hours, days, weeks, months, they don't have time to wait. And so it's really interesting to think about how, as an industry, we can become more efficient, better at, number one, moving people through that process, and number two, giving them an idea of what's happening as they move through the process. And that's something the current company I work for, ProofPilot, is trying to do. So we're both trying to support sites and sponsors to with the technology to move people through the funnel process more automatically, with less intervention from the site, by connecting to other technology systems like IRT and EDC, but also at the same time providing an experience for patients where, in that white space where maybe they haven't heard from a site, or there's, time elapsing, they're getting at least some information, what's going to happen in a study, all of those different things, trying to kind of demystify it, and at least put some information where otherwise they might just be sitting there waiting to wonder, is anyone ever calling me back? What's the next step? So, I think there's still a long way to go, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in the space to sort of look at the different tools that are already out in the space and figure out how to stitch them together and make the experience better for patients, better for sites, and ultimately better for sponsors who want to move these therapies, into the marketplace.
I think one of the things that a lot of people in this space don't talk about, that I preach about, is that most people, when they look at a clinical trial, don't qualify. And the reaction of that patient when they don't qualify is sometimes, quite often, quite emotional, negatively emotional, which leaves them thinking very badly about clinical trials in general, and specifically that one. One of the things I preach about is making sure that patients, when they don't qualify, or they don't randomize, is to point them to other resources and to say, hey, can I keep you on the list for future opportunities? And to stay in touch with that patient, even if they don't qualify, to try and leave a better taste in their mouth. Because I think so often we're poisoning the well for not just our trials in the future, but all trials in the future. And I think that goes a long way toward what you're talking about, is we just need better PR for the sector.
Yeah. Well, and you make a great point. And let me tie this back to this idea of healthcare organizations getting into clinical trial space, because I think it can take a nice little circle here.
Yeah.
Which is exactly, we historically have treated clinical trial recruitment as a very sort of like, it's an exercise in, I need someone and I need them now. So it's transactional, right? I need you for this thing and that's it. Think liken it to like a direct response ad, like on TV for, I don't know, something you see late at night.
Yeah. Gets you nice, slice it, dice
or
it.
something. They just want you to buy something and that's it. So that's sort of how we've approached patient recruitment to this point in time. And a large reason for that is that there's like no coordination between sponsors and different programs. Even sometimes within sponsors, there's no coordination if you're doing multiple programs. And I think where these larger healthcare organizations can come into play is if they're doing large volumes of work, it's much easier to say, oh, we're so sorry you don't qualify for this, but here's a whole host of other studies that we're also involved with. Maybe one of these would be right for you, or maybe one of these is right for your family member. And continuing that dialogue instead of just dropping them off and saying, sorry, you don't qualify. Well, see if we ever reach out to you again. And I think that's where we have a lot of opportunity as well to continue. If someone's expressed interest in a clinical trial today and they don't qualify, well, they're probably still interested in participating in research. We just have to figure out how to match them with the right research. And that's something I don't think we've figured out very well today, but hopefully with the emergence of some of these larger players who have these broad relationships with patients, and then maybe are going to be able to do a large volume of work just by virtue of the access that they have to individuals, maybe that can help us on our way. So that's certainly something we think about, building communities, trying to introduce research opportunities as we work with, our partners. But it's certainly an area where I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, patient journey is something that, obviously I'm very passionate about, and obviously we're very passionate about it, whether it be preclinical or post-commercialization. It's all about the patient experience. And I think that applies even more so in clinical trials, because we're asking somebody to give of themselves. In post-commercialization, it's the other way around. They're writing a check to buy, or a credit card to buy a drug. We're asking a lot of these patients, when they do randomize, what are some of the things we can do to help make that journey easier and more positive?
Yeah, I think that's really a really great question. One of the things that we think is in particular at the company I'm at now, ProofPilot, but across, organizations I've worked at before and with the sponsors that we speak to, I think everyone is aligned that we need to be more transparent with patients. We need to give them more information up front. We need to help them have access to the tools that they need. It's sort of interesting. We were working on a project just in the recent weeks and did some patient feedback on a tool that we provide, which is basically like a patient journey. So it's, once you're engaged in the study, you sign up for the application. Within the application, you have all the things that you need to do, all the resources you might need, videos, everything about your visits, all of that stuff, all in a place that's contained, right? We typically like contained on the internet, I should say. So you can always go back and access it. Typically, right, we do, as an industry, printed materials, things like that, which is great, super helpful to have, but it's also, if you're in a study for 2 years, I don't know about you, like, give me a piece of paper, like, you're lucky if I have it a week from now, forget 2 years from now. And so I think this idea of just kind of thinking about how people interact with the world, and sometimes there's like a disconnect, I think, in this industry
Seems
between,
kind of obvious to me. I don't know.
well, even like
When you say it that way.
I was putting together like this vertical garden, like it's a hydroponic garden for my parents, and it didn't come with any instructions. You had to go online to the website. You found the instructions there, but then they can update those instructions anytime. Your instructions are never aged. Same idea, right? If something changes, it's very easy to update that in a digital environment. It's very hard to update that in a printed material environment. So we're very, I think, accustomed to doing all of this, stuff that we think is new and exciting in clinical trials in our everyday. And we would probably be annoyed if it was taken away in our everyday life. But we, as an industry, I think sometimes are hesitant to apply the same methodologies because it's new, it's different. We haven't done it before. And again, in a highly regulated industry, sometimes it's easier to just revert to the things that are tried and true because like, okay, I know exactly how this is going to go. I know that everybody's going to agree to it and we're going to be fine. And it's not.
Faxing is the best example of that. Faxing, we still fax the doctor's offices regularly. I mean, thousands and thousands of faxes a month to this day, because it's the most HIPAA compliant fashion that they can receive information.
Which is interesting because that is, it's theoretically HIPAA compliant, right? Until the top sheet falls off and the document is floating around the office. But what we don't see, there's questions we don't ask about certain things that are like historical methodologies. But I do think, we are moving in the right direction. We're certainly seeing people be more willing. And I think what's actually driving some of the change is to go back to this, comment I made about, having patient feedback is sometimes the most kind of influential voice is actually the user voice. And in this case, it's the patient voice. And so when the patient is looking at, a set of tools and materials and saying, oh, this is actually super helpful to me. And no, I don't mind logging in. And no, I don't mind, going back and forth, to this application or getting notifications. Actually, that's helpful to me. It helps to win over folks who say, oh, well, nobody's going to want to do that, or that's too much of a burden. And so sometimes I think, and this just goes back to the assumptions we make and the stories we tell ourselves, is it's really important to talk to the people that you're designing for, whatever it is, whether it's it can be as simple as a screener, right? Like sometimes we use language that like patients don't use to describe their disease, or they use different terminologies. I'm sure you're very familiar with that, right? So we have to talk to people the way that they talk about themselves and their disease. We have to think and talk to them about how they want to consume information, what's convenient for them, and not just assume. And I think it's very easy to kind of be in our.
Well, I think part of that is, to your point, it's navigating the legal and regulatory environment.
That's true.
And you don't want to say something that's going to be in violation of the legal and regulatory framework. And so I think that's where we revert back to these very clinical terms and not very patient-friendly terms. And when we design patient scripts, and we're constantly looking for ways to script it in a patient-friendly environment. And I think part of the challenge is getting attorneys to sign on to that, to review it and say, that's not being friendly. We actually put it in the script word for word.
And the funny part is, right, is if you went into the doctor's office and someone's talking about the study, like
right.
nobody's policing that conversation.
Correct.
And it's a very different thing. And I think when we're talking about, this sort of third party, whatever it is, whether it's web, whether it's phone, whatever, talking to you about a clinical trial, I mean, this is a very serious thing in a lot of cases. People might, if they're looking for a study that could help them in their disease or potentially help other people with their disease in the future, they might have a lot of questions. They might want to feel that warmth or feel it not be so stark and clinical. And my feeling is that, IRBs are typically pretty helpful when it comes to evaluating different things. I think there's also the notion of like compensation and people being reticent, or legal teams being reticent to want to talk about compensation up front. But frankly, let's be honest, a lot of people participate in research not only because of compensation, but they wouldn't participate potentially if there wasn't compensation. People are taking time out of their day. Maybe they're sacrificing hours at their job. They need to get childcare. They need, we shouldn't be shy about helping people understand that they will be able to get some remuneration for their time and contribution to a study. I mean, some of these visits are like 5, 6, 10 hours long. a huge imposition on somebody's life. So I think all of those things, typically my experience has been when you bring it to the IRB, as long as, it's reasonable, there's no issue. I think the question is, you have to be willing to bring it to the IRB. You have to be willing to ask the question.
You have to be not afraid to bring it to IRB.
Exactly. And I think that's
and stand by the rationale why they should approve it, because you're right. I mean, and if you want diversity in a trial as well, you're going to have to offer some type of compensation, because someone who's an hourly worker can't afford to take off a day of work.
Absolutely. And not only the idea of hourly workers, but just people who have other obligations, like what do you do with your kids or your elderly family member who needs attention, or whatever it might be, or maybe you're going a very far distance and you need, travel reimbursement, or maybe it's as simple as like, hey, you need to eat something and you need to be, like the least you can do is reimburse somebody for lunch, right? If they're going to
even the airlines do that when you cancel a flight, right?
Yeah. So I do think, to some degree we are collectively a little bit a victim of this mindset of like, the answer is going to be no before we ask the question. And so, I think like I said, I think we're inching forward in the right direction. I think we have a long way to go. But I do see, and this is, I think, a heartening thing, that when people are approached and when, the circumstances allow, people really do seem to want to participate. And like you said, there are people who are very disappointed when they can't.
Yeah, the disappointment is palpable. I've listened to a lot of calls, and I that was what gave me the idea. We're listening to these calls, and they hang up, and you just hear the sadness, and it's like, isn't there something we can do for these people? And so it's like, we started looking at what are the resources, what are the websites they can be going to that might not be aware of. What are the the advocacy groups? What are other trials? You want to hear about other? And just by saying you didn't qualify for this one, but by just taking that extra 60 seconds. And it costs money to take that extra 60 seconds or a minute and a half, 90 seconds. But I think it's worth it for a lot of reasons.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think, we have to remember that every person who's screening into a clinical trial is a person. And oftentimes that person, depending on what kind of study it is, has a real health issue that they're trying to resolve in some way. And if they're turning to clinical research to solve it, that probably means that maybe they're not getting what they need from a traditional therapy, or maybe they're not able to access a traditional therapy for whatever reason. So yeah, I mean, I think you have a unique perspective because your team is talking to patients all the time. And I think those of us who interact with patients and hear their feedback and listen to these calls, or, see their reactions. I've been very privileged to be able to do that over the years. And I think you get this idea that it's not just a number in the IRT or in the EDC. These are real people who are really looking for solution.
They're looking for answers, and they're desperate for answers in many cases, and that desperation, I think, is what drives the emotion. And and I think that emotion is something that can be a positive thing that we can tap into in the future. And I was thinking all that emotion is just wasted if we can't,
But I think it also points to this idea, right, that people really do want to participate. And so this, there's this kind of this juxtaposition of like, we can never find enough people, and then people
we can't find enough people that qualify.
Well, that's a whole other story. And we talk a lot with our sponsors about, ways to like make clinical trials, easier to qualify for. But we always like, my sort of perspective is, look, you got to do the science you have to do, but understand that the consequences of each choice you make with your inclusion exclusion, right, is going to be a trade of whether you're able to have more people or whether you're able to have less people. And that's okay. I mean, it's just, we have to understand that those things are true.
Now, we had talked about this before, but as we're talking, I'd love to get your opinion and to wrap it up with this topic of the role of social media in recruiting, because we've been there from the beginning. I think we did one of the very first trials. We actually did a site on Facebook, and it was, oh my God, getting it through IRB was impossible. It's like, you're kidding me. Facebook, this is probably over 10 years ago, but now it's become a default. You can't have a study unless you got an Instagram, on Facebook, and you got to have everything, and you got to brand it, and you got to name it. Has it been helpful? And what's the future of social media?
I think absolutely. So I see Instagram ads and Facebook ads and stuff. Used Reddit, used, every social media platform you can imagine. And I do think it works. It's a broad audience, right? I mean, it makes sense that you would go to Facebook. There's billions of people there. And they have a fantastic advertising platform. So you can test all your creative, like, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I do think that things change a little bit, right? Like in the last several years, Facebook has tightened their ability to do, targeting of people based on interests related to health, et cetera, which is fine and great as an individual, harder for us as people who want to promote clinical trials, but that's okay. One of the things I think that's really fantastic about social media platforms, and Facebook I'll use as a specific example, is the idea that you can use lookalike audiences. So once you have people who've either shown interest or matriculated into your study and you know who they are, you can, you can look for like people by using their information as a proxy, right? And so all of that is super helpful if you're looking for people who are similar to those who are already taking actions that you want in your study, whether it be referrals or whether it be all the way down to randomized. So that's super helpful. And I think the sophistication of those ad platforms really helps. I think that, it's important to be where people are and where people are having conversations or thinking about their health, and Facebook happens to be a place where people do that. One of the places that I think is interesting, and I haven't really seen a ton of clinical trial advertising so far, is TikTok. Although what I do see on TikTok is a lot of health advocates. So people talking about rare disease, people talking about, so more like health influencers. So I think there's probably a place somewhere there to engage with people who are super involved in their own disease community and promoting that on a platform like TikTok that's a lot more sort of like video driven. So that's something I'm looking forward to seeing in the future. I don't think like clinical trials has done a good job of engaging like influencers in that way. I remember back in like maybe the 2010-ish era, we talked about bloggers and things like that. I do think there's more space to make a dent, with people who have their own large audience and can influence. But again, it's something that is new, and I don't know
Michael J. Fox Foundation idea,
a good thing, but yeah, but even in a more micro way, where it's just people who are like literally talking about, their own struggle with, disease X, and they get a lot of people. I think people have communities like that on Reddit, et cetera. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm looking forward to seeing if that kind of comes to the surface in the future, but haven't seen much yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's the communities are developing, evolving on all social media, and tapping into those communities is really the goal, I think, of any recruiter.
Absolutely.
How do you get into those communities? How do you get your stuff posted in there? So,
yeah.
Well, Bernadette, this has been an absolute joy. I could talk all day about this stuff because you just are a wealth of knowledge. I got about 10 other questions that I left on my piece of paper that I'd love to chat about another time. But thank you very much for taking the time to talk about a really, really important subject, because I mean, we've had several guests on in this space, and I think after COVID, I think we all kind of said, "Oh, look at all our recruitment problems are solved." And we feel like we're right back to where we were before COVID.
I know. Well, I appreciate your interest in the topic, and certainly it was a delight chatting with you. And it's an area that's very close to my heart, so always happy to talk about it.
Well, thank you, Bernadette. Have a great day.
Thank you too.